In Eastern Europe, a large swath of the population lived in small villages called shtetls. And I gave a handout to everybody. It's got a glossary in the back, and hopefully a lot of the difficult words will be there. There are some song translations as well and some photos. But they lived in shtetls, small villages, and they pretty much isolated. They were Jewish enclaves, and the language that they spoke was Yiddish. Now, Yiddish bears a close resemblance to certain German dialects. It has a lot of Hebrew words and phrases in it, and it's actually written with Hebrew letters, although it's transliterated for for people that don't read Hebrew. So, for instance, your translations all are transliterated with Roman letters, but. When Yiddish was the spoken language, Hebrew was the sacred language that was reserved only for chanting in the synagogue. Yiddish was their common tongue, the Mamaloshon, it's called, the mother tongue. And when almost the entire Yiddish population was wiped out, the entire culture disappeared, and Klezmer was a part of the culture. So Klezmer disappeared, just disappeared. However, before it disappeared, it had, for a brief time, it had a parallel existence in this country. From about the 1880s to the 1920s, approximately 2.5 million Jewish immigrants came to America. They settled mostly in New York, although in a lot of other urban centers, Philadelphia, in Toronto, also in Canada, Chicago, Baltimore. And there was such a large number of immigrants that Klezmer was actually commercially viable during that time. And it was a commercially viable art form. Like all immigrants, they brought their food and their religious traditions and their language and everything. So there were Yiddish radio stations and Yiddish record companies and lots of Klezmer music and Yiddish theater. But Klezmer disappeared in this country as well. And it disappeared because the children and the grandchildren of the immigrants that came assimilated, and like the children of immigrants probably universally, really wanted to distance themselves from the sort of most blatant old world aspects of their parents' and grandparents' generation. So we can think of the old world as Europe, and the new world as America. And they really wanted to distance themselves. And Klezmer was absolutely old world, no question about it. So it was by the 1950s, it was just about gone. And by the 1960s, it was almost completely gone. I mean, to how children who were being bar mitzvahed in this country in the 1960s would never dream of having Klezmer music at their wedding or bar mitzvah or something. It was totally unthinkable. So it disappeared. However, about 20 years ago, a Klezmer revival began. And this renewed interest coincided with a number of things. It coincided with multicultural curriculums that are just sort of proliferated around, with globalization, with world music, with interest in world music. And it also coincided with a generation of baby boomers trying to look and find out about their own roots. And Klezmer is really part of their heritage. And so people began to look back. And what they discovered was that far from being an embarrassment, this music was absolutely wonderful. And so a huge revival has sprung up, and it continues to this day. And when we talk about a Klezmer revival, the word revival actually can be used literally, because we're talking about the Holocaust. I mean, you can't think about Klezmer without thinking about the Holocaust. The two are totally interconnected. So revival is the right word, brought back to life. Now, I'll just make one more point about all of this before we start actually playing. And that is that there's no way to recreate this music exactly as it was heard in Eastern Europe, or for that matter, exactly as it was heard in this country in the 20s and 30s. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. My clarinet is a modern clarinet. If you look at, on your handout, there's the first picture, there's a picture of the drum. It's called a poik. And it's a wonderful Yiddish word, a poik. And it's a bass drum with a cymbal attached on top, and it had straps so they could wear it when they would march and travel. And so they didn't have a drum set. And they certainly didn't have a piano. They maybe had a concertina or something of that sort, or an accordion. And so the music sounded very different. So even if I brought just my combo, for instance, instead of an orchestra, it wouldn't sound the same. And authenticity, authenticity is a very complicated word and a very complicated idea. What's authentic, what's not. But but more importantly than the actual instruments in terms of authenticity is the fact that we're all products of our time. And musicians and artists play, and people think, whether you're a musician or not, according to what's in your senses. Musicians have music in their ear. We can't help having had rock music in our ear for the last 30 years. It's just there. And it inevitably is going to come out when you play, whether you want it to or not. It's part of our being, and the way we think, and the way we are. And so like I said, there isn't any way that I could recreate the music exactly. So I didn't try. What I thought instead was to make the music come alive as much as possible. And that way you would have a sense of what Klezmer is really all about. You would really get the sense of the spirit of the music. And that's why I brought the symphony orchestra. Klezmer revivalists today fuse their Klezmer with all kinds of styles. They fuse it with rock and with avant-garde jazz and with reggae and rap and everything you can imagine. And the symphony orchestra is mind-blowing. So when I was looking to expand and grow, I decided to do it with the symphony. So that's why the symphony orchestra is here today. And so again, I wasn't trying to be radical. I was just trying to make the experience as vibrant and true to its spirit as much as I could. And because, really what we're talking about is what was lost in the Holocaust and what survived. And when we talk about what survives, anything that survives, by definition, creates anew and grows. And that's what Klezmer is doing. So, this expression, the medium is the message. Well, the medium is part of today's message. So, let's go back to the old world for a second and talk about Klezmer music. Now we use the word Klezmer to describe a style of music. In the old world, in Eastern Europe, before the Holocaust, it was only used to refer to a person who played the music. So Klezmer meant musician, and the suffix "im," klezmorim, is the Hebrew suffix "im" makes something plural. So klezmorim means several musicians, more than one musician. They never ever used it to refer to the music itself, like we do today. The word klezmer comes from two Hebrew words. Kale, which means vessel, like a goblet or something that holds something else. And zimmer, which means song in Hebrew. So kale, zimmer, klezmer. It was this Yiddish contraction of these two Hebrew words. And kale means vessel, zimmer means song. So put together it means vessel of song. And when you think about it, it's really a wonderful illustration or example of what shtetl society, Yiddish society, thought of their musicians. They saw them as vessels. A vessel means it's not about the musician. You're just a channel. for the inspiration. The inspiration comes from on high, from the divine, from some better part of the human self, whatever you think. And it comes through the vessel and comes out through the instrument to be shared with others. And it's really a very enlightened and a mystical view of how that society thought of their musician. And I think it's a wonderful, words and names and labels can teach us a great deal when we're looking at history. And I think this teaches us something about how they thought about their musician. However, despite this very enlightened view of the musician, the actual Klezmorim were very poor. They were very they weren't regarded very highly. They were mistrusted to some degree. They had to travel to make a living. So from village to town, they would travel. A lot like freelance musicians do today. And so because of that, they were viewed with some skepticism about, money, and they could, cheat you with, come into town and leave and take money for a wedding and whatever. There's a wonderful song called Oy Mama. Old Yiddish song. Oy Mama, bin ich verliebt. Oh Mama, I'm so in love. And the mother says, who are you in love with? And she says, I'm in love with a Klezmer. I'm in love with a musician. And that's the tension in the song, because, nobody wants their daughter to marry a musician. So their social status is practically at the bottom of the already marginalized Jewish society. And part of this was because of their itinerant status, and part of this also was because they had a fairly close association with the Romani people, with gypsies. And I don't like to use that word because there's a lot of negative stereotypes associated with the word gypsy. But the Romani people were also itinerant. They traveled all the time in families and in tribes, and they were also highly respected for their musicianship. If you ever listen to gypsy music, even today, it's incredible. It's a very distinctive style, and so there was a close musical connection between the Klezmorim and the Romani. And the gypsies were even more mistrusted than the Klezmer, even more than the Jews almost. And certainly they suffered in the Holocaust as well. So probably because of this common outsider status, that was another, between the Klezmer and the gypsies, that was probably another reason why the Klezmer were pretty low on the totem pole in shtetl life. Because the Klezmer traveled, their music was influenced by whatever region they were in. So Klezmer from Hungary sounds very different than Klezmer from Ukraine, for instance. Yiddish is the same way. Yiddish is a very fluid language. Even to this day, Yiddish speakers, few that there are, in New York have expressions, very New York expressions, that they didn't have in Eastern Europe, because it adapts. The music adapts, the people adapts, everything adapted itself. They were people in the diaspora, and they had to adapt. One final comment about Old World Klezmer before we play. Many of them came from family dynasties, I sort of use that word loosely, family dynasties of musicians, where the musical profession was passed down from one generation to the next. And very often in Yiddish, the surname, the last name, refers to the profession. So if you ever hear the name Musiker, that was actually a very common name in this country for a while. Obviously they were musicians. Fiedler, Arthur Fiedler was a famous conductor, fiddler. This applies also to non-musical names as well. The name Schneider is a very common name, meant tailor. And there's a newscaster on MSNBC, David Schuster. So somewhere in Eastern Europe, in his background, there was a shoemaker somewhere along the line. So let's hear what this music sounds like. We're going to start, Brian and I are going to start with an old folk tune called Ashes Kyle. Now, the motor scale that this tune was based on is a very Hebraic-sounding succession of notes. And these modes, or scales, also relate to the cantorial modes that the cantor sings, or chants, in the synagogue. And it's important to remember, though, that this music is secular music. This is music from wedding dances and lullabies and theater and secular, non-religious music. It may have some mystical elements, but it's secular music, compared to synagogue music, which is liturgical, which is sacred. Synagogue music was in Hebrew, Klezmer music is in Yiddish, and certain inflections also make this sound Jewish. So I can play a lot of bends. Also, something called a krecht, which is like it's like a sound that gets stuck in your throat. Yiddish has that too. There's a word in Yiddish called fargenigen. And you don't say fargenigen, you say fargenigen. It's like it's in there. And the music is the same way. There's also this kind of sound, which clarinetists love to play, and clarinetists give it a very technical term. We call it nyap-yaps. And all of these inflections are also heard by the cantor in the synagogue when chanting is done. And so there's these musical, stylistic overlaps, even though they're separate entities. Now, our next selection is also a folk song. And this song, I'm going to read the lyrics to you. This song, to me, reflects a great deal about Yiddish attitudes. One of the things that I love about Yiddish music is that there's almost a complete absence of sentimentality in it. You know, life is good sometimes, and sometimes life is hard, but it's all part of life, and you just have to accept it all. You know, a wedding is a joyous occasion. What do? You break a glass to symbolize sharp edges down the road, most likely. You know, sunrise, sunset. I mean, it's all part of life. And so this song, to me, reflects this sort of lavish, philosophical outlook on life. This is called To the Fair. And it's not, they don't mean fair like carnival fair. It means like a market, an open-air market. So, Shreitzit mir mit Gichefit. Quick steps, I went to the fair to buy a horse. Fair means a horse. And my purse jingled with coins. Und a little zingeth mir, and I sang a little song. The city was still a long way off, and I came to an inn. I said, "Innkeeper, balabus, give me a drink, give me a glazel." And nach a glazel, another drink, another glass, and another glass. And now, who wants to go to the city? Who wants to go to the fair? Who needs a horse? No horse, no money. Now it's surus, which means worry. Surus makes me skip and sing.
Sprech ich mir mit Getke, Ried. Noch a Fähre zum Jarid. Mitten Teisle kling ich mir, und Talero sing ich mir. Lai, 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 lai. Schott ist Wein noch sehr weit. Schlemper crash me bei der Zeit. Prinzip ist die Tier. Klezmer, gib ein Gläsel mir. Noch ein Glas. Lass mir de Palette was. Wat mir schrot und wenn ja wird. Kind fährt, darf ich nicht. Nicht gekauft. Und das geht schon lang nicht gekauft. Und verzorre spring ich mir. Und alle da sing ich mir.
And I'm not sure if we tuned before, did we? So why don't we tune now? Think of like a real orchestra concert. Which this is. This is a children's song. It's called In Azer Kleinem Hois, from a little house, a very little house. And it's a children's song, and with each repetition of the verse, of the words, a line is left out, a line of lyrics is left out. And instead there are hand signals. And there are American songs like this too. And finally, at the end, you're only left with hand signals. So you might learn a little Yiddish from this song, which is good. If you want to do the hand signals, you can do it. From a little house, a little man looks out. Sees a rabbit running by. Sitzak does with Shrek, trembling with fear. Help mir, schreit der Heus. Help me, screams the rabbit. Jeder der einem schiss mich Heus, before the hunter, before another person kills me. Come inside, little rabbit. And we'll be very happy together. And this word glichlech, it's a great Yiddish word. Can you try saying that? Glichlech. You get a real sound, you get a real sense of the gutturalness of the Yiddish language. Let me hear it. Glichlech. You really got to get the cha. Yeah, you got to spray and infect everybody around you. That's right. Okay, so let's do this song.
Sehr kleinen Häus, Lumba Mensche leer Reus, läuft der Herzerlei vorbei, sitzt auf und Schreck. Helft mir, shit der Heut, jeder schützt mehr Eus.
Dünne Herzen leer rein, geschützt wird sein.
Läuft der Herzerlei vorbei, zittert auf und schreck. Helft mir, schreit der Heut, jeder schützt mehr Eus.
Dünne Herzen leer rein, wichtig wird mir sein.
Schreit der Heut, jeder schützt mehr Eus. Oma Herzerle allein, wie recht wird mir sein. Helf mir, Oma Herzerle allein, wie recht wird mir sein. It's not easy.
Many of the Klezmer tunes were in this very Hebraic sounding mode. And I don't know if you could tell, but this one was not. So the first tune that I played was in this mode. And Brian, you play a D minor chord. A lot of Klezmer is in this mode. But this song was in this, where I can play D major. Sorry, wait, we're wrong. It doesn't sound very Klezmer. It sounds like a German folk song, and in fact, it probably was a German folk song that had Yiddish lyrics put to it later on. But nevertheless, there were Jews in Germany, and Klezmer, wherever there was Jews, there was Jewish music. So that's why I wanted to do this. Now, I don't want to paint too broad a brush, but there's a whole aspect of German Jewish culture which I just want to touch on very quickly. And that is that, by and large, German Jews were much more sophisticated than the shtetl Jews. They were much more assimilated. To a large degree, they thought of themselves as Germans first, and then Jews. And they didn't speak Yiddish, and they had very little connection to actual Klezmer music. To them, Yiddish was like low class. It was like peasant. It was peasant music, peasant culture. And they were of a very different level in society, and they were much more assimilated. There were many musicians in Germany. A lot of them were concert symphony musicians and conductors. And Klezmer was not their thing. Yiddish was not their thing. They called Yiddish a jargon, a slang. It wasn't even like a language to them. And for one of these reasons, it's one of the reasons why when the Nazis came for the Germans, they were very surprised. Little by little, there were more restrictions put on them, and then they had to give up their cars, and then they had to give up their automobiles, and then they had to give up their jobs at the universities, and eventually into forced labor, and eventually deportation, etc. And there's a wonderful book by Victor Klemperer. It's a 2-volume set of his diaries. And they paint an incredible picture of Germany during the 30s and 40s. It starts in the 30s and goes through the bombing of Dresden, which he actually survived. But he was German, and it was a complete surprise as gradually, eventually people saw the writing on the wall, but initially it was a big surprise. So if you're interested in that, it's Victor Klemperer diaries. one other little anecdote about all this, you know, in upstate New York where I live, I play a lot of his concerts and I play at Jewish community centers and synagogues and things like this. And I became friendly with the person who would come to my programs, even though he really hated Klezmer music. But he would come just to sort of be supportive or whatever. And he had grown up in Germany. He was a survivor. He and his family fled, and they fled to Spain, and then eventually to London, and then eventually to America. And he came up to me one time after a program, and he said, do you know what we called, when I was growing up, do you know what we called the Yiddish language? And I said, no. And he sort of chuckled, and he said, we called it murdered German, which was so unsettling for a lot of reasons to me. I mean, partly that after all this time, all these years, and everything that happened, that he still had this very, you know, negative view of Yiddish and Yiddish culture and the Yiddish language, and that it was still beneath him, very much so. And also the irony of calling it murdered German when, you know, it was really the other way around. Okay, so we're going to move on to another selection here. And I think doing children's programming is really good. Children weren't spared in the Holocaust. And I think it makes the whole thing that we're trying to portray here a little less abstract. You know, it's like seeing that exhibit of the shoes from the concentration camps. It's, you really, you know, these were real people with real children and real stories and real lives. This is an old Yiddish folk tale that is set to music. It'll be done in English. And the Yiddish is called Der Wissendicke Rebbe, the wisest of the wise rabbi. And the alternate title is Things Could Always Be Worse. And I like to call this song A Jewish Peter and the Wolf.
With his wife and children. The noise and confusion had driven him to the end of his rope, so he went to his rabbi and said, "Wise Rabbi, what am I to do? My wife, she screams. The kids, they fight. I can't stand it anymore." And the rabbi said, "Hoshel, do you have a chicken? Go home and bring the chicken into your hut." So the man walked home and did as he was told. 1 week later, he went back to the rabbi and said, "Wise Rabbi, what am I to do? The chicken, it clucks. My wife, she screams. The kids, they fight. I can't stand it anymore." And the rabbi said, "Herschel, do you have a cow? Go home and bring the cow into your hut." So the man walked home and did as he was told. 1 week later, he went back to the rabbi and said, "Wise Rabbi, what am I to do? The cow, it moves. The chicken, it clucks. My wife, she screams. The kids, they fight. I can't stand it anymore." And the rabbi said, "Herschel, "Do you have a horse? Go home and bring the horse into your hut." So the man walked home and did as he was told. 1 week later, he went back to the rabbi and said, "Wise Rabbi, what am I to do? The horse it neighs, the cow it moos, the chicken it clucks, my wife she screams, the kids they fight. I can't stand it anymore." And the rabbi said, "Herschel, go home. Put the horse in the barn, put the cow in the field, put the chicken in the yard. Go home, Herschel." So the man walked slowly home and did as he was told. He went back to his rabbi and said, "Rabbi, my house is so quiet now. I sleep like a baby. How can I ever thank you?"
These are all new orchestrations. These don't come from Eastern Europe, from the Old World at all. They're very contemporary. A lot of them were done by a friend of mine who's a colleague of mine from New England Conservatory, and Brian Wilson has done it here, which I'll talk about later. Now, one of the most important Jewish life cycle events, still is, but was particularly important in the show, was the wedding. And the wedding was much more than just ceremony and party like it is today. It lasted for days, and there were many rituals associated with it. And the reason it was so important is because it really meant the survival of the community. It meant economic security for the bride. That's why Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof was so intent on his daughters getting married. Economic stability. It meant Jewish continuity by having children. So it was a very, very, very important part of life. So what we're going to do is do a sort of a musical travelogue through a Jewish old world wedding. And the first thing we're going to start with is called Firn de Machatunim. Translates, Firn means traveling, and Machatunim means in-laws. So traveling, escorting the in-laws to the wedding is really sort of what it means. But Machatunim doesn't exactly mean in-laws, and this takes a little bit of explaining. There's no word that translates in English for Machatunim. Machatunim was the relationship of the parents of the bride to the parents of the groom, especially the mothers, the mother of the bride to the mother of the groom. They're each other's Machatunim. They're not each other's in-law. I mean, the mother of the groom would be the daughter's in-law, but they're not each other. The parents to each other are not in-laws. We don't have a word for it. And the reason we don't have a word for it in our language is because it's not a very important relationship. Survival doesn't depend on marriage and staying together the way it did back then. And because their society gave this relationship a name, we can deduce the fact that it was a very important relationship. There are many songs about the Machatunim. It was a relationship that was probably fraught with some degree of tension, two strong women, the mother of the bride, the mother of the groom. There was a lot of tension between the bride and very often and her mother-in-law. So anyway, so that's why the society, and when a society names something, you can figure that it's probably important. You know, in our culture, the word teenager didn't come into existence until the 1950s, when all of a sudden there was a whole lot of people who were between the ages of 13 and 19 who had money to spend. They could be marketed to. They were important, and it was because there was the baby boomer generation, so there were a lot of them. They had leisure time and leisure money. So our society gives them a name, teenager. There was no name, that word didn't exist before that. So, you know, when you're thinking about history, you can sort of think about all these different things. So we're going to play, if you're in the Auditorium, it's very processional. You can picture the families coming to the wedding, to the chuppah, to the town, to the village for the wedding. of music called a doina. A doina is a non-metrical cadenza-like free rhythm, non-metered, quasi-improvisatory solo. A violinist would play, a clarinetist would play. And the idea was sometimes called music to make the bride cry. Now, why would you want to make the bride cry at her wedding? Well, again, this goes back to sort of this very pragmatic and realistic way of life for the Jews, that yes, it's a joyous occasion, yes, it's a happy occasion, but for the bride, you know, if you think about it, she was probably leaving her family, she would probably go live with the groom and his family, she was leaving behind her youth, She would leave behind her hair. You know, in Orthodox tradition, and when a girl gets married, she shaves her head, and then from then on to the end of her life wears a head covering, a shako or a hat or a wig of some sort. And that gets into a whole other aspects of Jewish law, but so she's leaving behind her hair, she's leaving behind her youth. And so it was very bittersweet. So the doina is bittersweet. And from there, we're going to go on to some dances. They start with some very Hasidic, sort of heavy rhythmic dances, and goes into a wild and crazy freilach, joyous dance at the end. would like to portray, because it presents to you a slice of Jewish life that we haven't exactly covered yet. In the 1700s, there was a mystical spiritual movement that began in Poland, and the aim was to make prayer and devotion very personal. There was a feeling that it had sort of become very impersonal. By the 1800s, cantors were trained as opera singers and became very theatrical. So they wanted to make it they wanted every person to feel a connection with the divine. And this is called the Hasidic movement. Chesed in Hebrew means pious. So they gave themselves the name Hasidic. It was started by a man who is known as the Baal Shem Tov, which means master of the good name, or master of God's name. And the Baal Shem Tov has reached almost a legendary status in Hasidic culture and the whole Jewish mystical movement at this time. By all accounts, he was truly a mystic and truly a seer. He, like the Buddha, he went out, the story goes, went out to the woods, and he meditated for who knows how long, and he communed with nature, and he had visions, and he came back a mystic. And he trained his followers, who then had followers, who then had followers. So all the Hasidic sects can trace their lineage ultimately back to the Baal Shem. In addition to strict observance of Jewish law, dietary restrictions and all sorts of other restrictions, so they're very observant, the primary teaching was to connect with the divine. And one of the most important ways to connect with the divine was through music and through being joyful. That when you're joyful, when you're happy, you're actually connected with some higher power. You know, the yoga tradition has the same thing. They believe in the chakra system, and when your crown chakra opens with inspiration and it closes with fear. And when your crown chakra is open, you're in spirit, you're inspired. You know that feeling when you listen to like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or something and you get the goosebumps down your back, or whatever does it. Yeah, you know, everybody's different. Whatever does it for each individual person. But that feeling is an incredible feeling, and really what it means is that you're inspired in spirit. So sometimes I would tell my students, if they were nervous about taking a test or something, I would say, you know, think of something that inspires you, because you can't feel fear and inspiration at the same time. And somehow the Hasidim had this figured out. So they really have a huge emphasis on music, on dancing, on singing, and there's a whole body of music that has come through the Hasidic tradition. It's called nigun. A nigun is a song or a chant. Nigunim, again, that plural means, you know, a whole body of these nigun. And the main thing about nigunim is that they don't have words. And they don't have words because the feeling was that words keep you earthbound. And the whole aim is transcendence, is to transcend the here and now. So instead of words, they have lai 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 or yai dai dai, and you hear it over and over and over again. The nigunim are repeated over and over and over and over again like a mantra, and eventually you sort of reach this kind of hypnotic state, hopefully. So we're going to do a nigun. This is not an old nigun. This is actually a contemporary nigun. And we'll, in true Hasidic fashion, I'd like us all to sing together. Okay, so we'll all sing. You don't need to know any words. We're not going to do that many repetitions, so we might not reach transcendence this afternoon. But you never know. any thoughts, any questions?
What
Yeah.
dialect was that leadership? Was it Polish or Russian?
The Yiddish music, well, I don't exactly know. I know there's two main dialects. There's Litvak and Litiana. And I really don't know which one I've learned. But I couldn't tell you. I think I don't know. What happened was with the dialects is that Yiddish is such a fluid language that when after the war, survivors came here, and whatever Yiddish speakers there were came here, there was an institute called YIVO to try and codify the language. It had never been codified before. And so they standardized it, basically, some people. They standardized Yiddish. And I don't know which one makes up. I should know that. I don't. Any other questions?
When you say Klezmer disappeared, how did it come back? Where did they find the music?
I'm going to get to that when we talk about the revival. But what happened was there was some sheet music here in this country, although mainly it was passed on orally, the tradition is an oral tradition. But there were folios floating around. There were a few Klezmer musicians who had a career in this country in the 20s and 30s who were still alive in the 80s. Dave Harris is the name, after the grandma. And these people were alive. So some of these people, within the last 10, 15 years, found them and had them play to tape recorders and did this whole thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a number of people went over to the Soviet Union and also discovered a few musicians. There's a documentary called The Last Living Klezmer, I think it's called, very recent. And there was also some sheet music as well, and some old scratching recordings. So a lot of it's been transcribed now. So much has been transcribed from the old recordings and old, the field work, that there's a lot of music going on now. Anything else? Yeah.
What part of Europe did the Hasidic come from?
They came from Poland.
Oh,
Poland,
Were
yeah.
they the Gypsies?
No, they were very poor, the Hasidic. They were shtetl Jews. And this Baal Shem Tov just developed a following, and gradually it sort of spread. And each of the Baal Shem Tov's follower had sort of his own sect. So there's a Satmar sect, and there's a Lubavitcher sect, and there's a different. And like everything that gets institutionalized over time, it's possible for some of the essence to sort of get sublimated in the institutionalization, of the religion, of the spiritual practice. But at its essence, it was a very spiritual movement. And even the March for Song is very, and dancing, everybody wants to sing away. The dancers. I mean, it's only men that dance with each other, or women dance with each other, but the dancing gets pretty wild. Anything else? No? Good? Okay. Good, okay. Now, our next song is going to be the last little bit of Yiddish that you're going to hear today. We have an instrumental after that. It's worth noting that the disappearance of Klezmer and the disappearance of Yiddish as a spoken language are interconnected. There were not enough survivors after the war to left in Europe, obviously, to sustain the language. And the Yiddish speakers that came here assimilated, and there, after a while, generation or two, Yiddish wasn't spoken in the home, and so there was no more Yiddish there. When the state of Israel was established, after the war, there was a lot of discussion as to whether the language should be Yiddish or should it be Hebrew. It was eventually decided that it should be Hebrew. The reason was there was a feeling that Israel was to be sort of the homeland for Jews everywhere, not just the Ashkenazi Jews, not just the Eastern European Jews, who's basically were just the survivors of the Holocaust. And they felt Hebrew was more universal that way. There was also a feeling that Israel was really going to present a much more positive, strong image of Jews to the world. And there was a little bit of a feeling that Yiddish was very open. And so that was another reason why they chose Hebrew. There are a few Yiddish clubs around. I actually belong to one. I just kind of, get together and speak and read. And there are a few people who have Yiddish spoken in the home and still speak it. But basically, also a number of Hasidic sects actually have Yiddish as their spoken language in the home. And they have so many children that actually their dialect of Yiddish is actually growing. But for the most part, Yiddish is not, it's not a living language. It just isn't anymore. And that part of it is very sad. People that speak it now, that are trying to learn it now, do so for the sake of history, for the sake of intellectual curiosity, or for literature, or what have you. But it's not the common tongue. We're going to leave the old world with history, and we're going to go to the new world. And Yiddish theater thrived, Yiddish music thrived in the early part of the century. And as American Jews became better off economically, one of the signs that they had really joined the middle class was that they were able to afford summer vacations. And the vast majority of Jews, not the vast majority, but a lot of Jews lived in New York, and the Catskill region in upstate New York, about 2 hours from New York City, became known as the Borscht Belt. Hotels that catered to sort of, Jews who now had more money to spend a little bit more leisure time, and places whose names may sound familiar, they may not, the Concord, and Hutchins, and Grossinger's, and all of these hotels. And these hotels really thrived. So we're going to do a staple from the Borscht Belt, and it's called Romania. And the lyrics of Romania talk about, describe the memory of the homeland. The memory of the homeland. You have to remember, this is now Americanized Jews. So, in their memory, in the old country, everything was wonderful. The food was delicious, and the wine flowed freely, and life was an achaya, and life was a pleasure. This song was done so many times that it became something of a cliche, basically. If you ever watched the movie with Billy Crystal, Mr. Saturday Night, there's a version in it, and there's John Belushi did a version on Saturday Night. You can hear it. It became a caricature of itself, really. And actually, almost all of Klezmer music became a caricature of itself by the 1960s. And it was inevitable, but it was sad at the same time. So when we do Romania, though, I don't want it to sound like a grotesque caricature. I think the song has just amazing vitality and just a spirit to it that's wonderful. So we're going to do Romania for you now. And I need to say one other thing. This orchestration was done by our very own Brian Wilson. This was done a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago. And so I think it's a funny, crazy, archetypal Klezmer song.
In the late 50s and early 60s, there was a Jewish comedian, kind of social commentary person named Lenny Bruce. He's sort of like, our modern day Jon Stewart, but really much more. And Lenny Bruce always said, whether you're Jewish or not, if you live in New York City, you're Jewish. The same thing with this. Whether you're Jewish or not, if you have one of these caps, you're automatically Jewish. And you don't have to be circumcised. Can I say that here? I didn't.
Schöne.
fargenigen, was das Herz zu dir, das kannst du kriegen. Ah, mammeligele, ah, stramele, ah, carnazele, ohne Galesele Wein, vet men nicht, Wein trinkt mein überall, mehr verweist mich Quastaval. Heilige, dicke, dam, heilige, dicke, dam, heilige, dicke, dam, dicke, dicke, dam, heilige, dicke, dam, dicke, 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 dam, heilige, dicke, dam, dicke, dicke, dam. In Romania ist doch gut, von den Sorgen wird man nicht. Wein trinkt mein Schmecksinn Chef, mehr vorbei ist bis Kastrader. Maschine, könnt ihr Ringen, Angelringe, kannst du Träne, spitz der Stelle, denn ich spitz ab Matroselle. Sing mal, fei digge digge dam, sing mal, fei digge digge dam, sing mal, fei digge digge dam, sing mal, fei digge digge dam. Eises Ammerkeier, there's a candy side, Eises Marketing, trinken Wein und essen meine Ringer. Wer es kommt, dann sehen ich ab und jeder ist mir sicher. Sing mal, hei digge digge dam, sing mal, hei digge digge dam, sing mal, hei digge digge dam, sing mal, hei digge digge dam. Eises Ammerkeier, there's a candy side, Eises Marketing, Ponden, Männer, Schicker, Schettis, Kussen, Kaie, Keller, Pony, Taler, Schrabos, Maki, Kobo, Pole, Schabos, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Heilige Sammerkaya, der verkennt ich sein, Heilige Marketing, Kajem ohne kommen, beste Kajem ohne kommen, Mosche Kajem ohne still, Kappen Kosser in den Stil, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Heilige Gedam, Meier, Bände, Kodes und die Seine, Note, Kodes, Mosche Kajem in den Stil, Keppen Kodes in den Stil, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige Gedam, Setz! Heilige first part of the 20th century, Klezmer was commercially viable in this country, but it's worth mentioning that the word Klezmer was never used. It was not used to describe the musician, like it was in Eastern Europe, probably because English musicians have this very negative association with that word, because the Klezmer was so maligned. So they just called themselves musicians. And it was not used either as a term for the music. That was a Klezmer revivalist construct, and it was very conscious, and it was very deliberate. They're saying, we're going to Eastern Europe, we're going to unearth this music of Eastern Europe, we're going to call it, use the word that was used back then, and we're bringing it back to life after the Holocaust. In this country, they just
called it playing Jewish. My father is a clarinet player, played in the hotels, and all those years. And he said he never heard the word klezmer. They would play cha-cha, they'd play merengue, they'd play, foxtrot, and then they'd play Jewish, and that's what it was called. So the word klezmer is a revivalist term. And it's the exact reverse. Now we don't call the musician a klezmer, we call the music klezmer music. And as I said before, klezmer music fused their style, klezmer revivalists now fuse their style with many, many, many different styles. And there's a give and take. There was a give and take in this country between klezmer and Tin Pan Alley and jazz. There was a give and take in Europe between the gypsies and the klezmer. There's a give and take now between rock and roll and the current klezmer. So we're going to end our program with a klezmer fusion piece, but it is not as contemporary as you might hear now. By the way, for those of you younger people, if you're interested, you can go online and you can search out lots of different contemporary klezmer bands. I mean, some of them are really interesting. Some of it's not so great, but some of it's all interesting. It's all interesting, and you should really check it out. I think you probably like it. We're going to we're going to end in the 1940s with The Angels Sing. It was a big hit by the Benny Goodman Band. It was originally a klezmer frela called the Stieler Bulgar, the Quiet Bulgar. Benny Goodman had a big hit with it. Ziggy Elman took a klezmer solo in the middle of it, and the rest of it was all swing. And we're going to take that as our inspiration and go back and forth between the swing and the klezmer, and the swing and the klezmer. And Rick, you'll know the difference when you hear the klezmer beat and the reincarnation of Gene Krupa. So before we, and also I need to say, this is a world premiere of Brian Wilson. He did this for us. It's a recent piece. And before we play it, I need to thank a number of people, all the musicians, all the musicians. And I really, especially at this point, want to thank Myrna Goodman for inviting me. CDs for sale. The interns of the class have them for sale afterwards if you're interested. And it's been a pleasure. It really has.
Mm-hmm.